Good morning. Good morning. I like answering. Yes. I'm going to talk about some work that I've been involved with for the past about 16 years now. And my background's in urban planning. I don't come from the arts originally, but at the last 16 years I've been working at the edges of it, if you will. And much of my work has been about thinking of what makes for a good place to live, what's a healthy community. And more specifically, in low and moderate income communities, what are the kinds of qualities that one should be tracking over time if you want to see improvement? And often when people think about quality of life and what makes for a good place to live, you think about housing stock, crime, education, environment maybe. Seldom, however, is the idea of arts and culture on the radar when we think about what should we be tracking or measuring over time to see if communities are sustaining, if they're doing better, if they're getting worse. And my charge over the last several years has been trying to figure that question out. And interestingly, I'm often asked, as someone who's concerned primarily with low and moderate income communities and quality of life in them, why am I working with the arts? What does the art stuff have to do with quality of life in low and moderate income communities? And my response is in some ways historical, because I think if throughout the world and throughout the ages, strategies to oppress have typically included stripping people of their ability to organically and aesthetically express themselves and have that kind of expression that leads to strong sense of identity, strong connection to place. If that's been true throughout the world and throughout the ages, then why wouldn't strategies to build community have the arts at the core? So in my way of thinking, cultural vitality, this is supposed to change. Yeah. Cultural vitality, or the notion that there is evidence of people's ability to create, validate arts and culture as part of everyday life, is a really important part of how we should be thinking about communities. But taking this idea forward isn't always easy. And I think it isn't easy sometimes because of how, as a society, we've been conditioned to think about the arts. So one of the most instructive experiences that I've had in doing this research is many years ago, we did a pilot focus group discussion in Oakland, California. In pilot focus group discussions in research methods, usually you test whether it's a survey protocol or an interview or, in this case, a focus group guide to see if you're asking questions the right way to actually get the information that you seek to get. And in Oakland, we had assembled people from various neighborhoods, and we had an interest in understanding what kind of arts and culture were in their neighborhoods. And we knew something about the neighborhoods to begin with, so we weren't coming into this completely blind. But what we did in the pilot was very naively ask these people from these different neighborhoods, what kind of arts and culture is in your community? And they said, we don't have any. And we knew they did, so we said, okay, well, something's wrong with this question. So we changed the question, but before that I said, well, what do you mean you don't have any? And they said, well, we don't have any theaters, we don't have any museums, we don't have any concert halls. And what struck me was that they were talking about buildings that validate the activity that happened within them as arts and culture. They weren't really talking about activity outside of it. So it was clear to me that the word art in some ways was loaded, and that it didn't allow people to consider things that they might value and important things that have to do with creativity and aesthetics because the label precluded them from thinking about it. So we changed the question and we said, what kinds of creative expression is in your community? What kind of things do you find moving, challenging, beautiful? And then the conversation got very rich, and people talked about all kinds of things. They talked about bands, they talked about ethnic dance troupes, they talked about landscaping in yards, they talked about some things that had connection to big institutions downtown, but it was a really wide range of activity that they started to discuss with a lot of passion. And I asked them, do you think that this is art? And they argued, which was fine. Because from our perspective, we weren't so much interested in identifying the definitive definition of art so much as we were in identifying what was it that people cared about and why did they care about it, and what of those things might sit under eventually what came to be the umbrella of cultural vitality. But in moving forward with this work, what became very clear to me is that there was a need for a paradigmatic shift in how we think about the arts and various things that we associate with it. So one, I think, shift is the notion that we're all creative beings. A lot of times people will say very quickly, I'm not creative at all, or I don't have an artsy bone in my body. And you hear these kinds of things as a matter of course. And I think we're all creative people, and everyone may not have the gift of voice or the gift of poetry, but everyone has a gift that is based in creativity to deliver. And this is something that I believe and start with when I think about community design and policies to enhance quality of life in places. And one of the questions that I ask is, what are the characteristics of place that make it more likely for people to exercise their creativity and want to deliver whatever it is that their gift is? Another premise that I think needs to be put out there and counters some of what I've experienced is that art isn't confined only to cultural venues. And I think the example of the Oakland Focus Group discussion pointed to that to some extent. That if we think about art as only in those places that are that have the charge of presenting professional work, then we miss out on a lot of the other things that I think are really important to the fabric of community and to the character of place and to what makes people tick. So this idea of cultural venues, which I think cultural venues are great, I think we need to expand our purview in our thinking about art as unconfined. And where is it in our community? Can we identify it beyond the places where we're told that arts happens? When I started this work, one of the things that we did concurrently with a lot of field research in communities around the United States was actually do some work with the arts community to figure out what kind of data were they collecting on a regular basis? What did they care about to track? And what we found back then, and I must say things have changed in the course of the last 15 years, there was a lot of concern with audience participation, so butts in seats, and the idea of fiscal well-being of arts organizations, mostly presenting entities. So that is organizations that are presenting professional artwork for audience consumption or to be sold in a gallery or what have you. And what became clear is that what the cultural sector at that time was concerned with primarily was a very small sliver of the arts world or the cultural world in a more general sense. And it was very disconnected from what we were hearing from communities around the country, where there was concern about not just audience participation, although people did want to go to shows and see good art. There was concern about, more concern even, about making, doing, being actively engaged, exercising their creativity. People didn't just want to go see dance, they wanted to dance. They didn't want to only hear music, they wanted to dance to it and make music as well. So I think the idea of active arts engagement is something that is a really important concept to get us thinking beyond the notion of a consumptive kind of experience. So artists. Here too is another idea that has many preconceived notions associated with it. So people think that artists work in studios or they're hermetic and they don't come out. They produce a product that people will buy or you'll go see on the big screen. But the assumption is that it's a mediated relationship to publics or that artists are on their own enclave. They're in their own enclave and they do their own thing. And in fact, the work that I've been doing over the last few years, much of my work has been focused on the role of artists in communities and their multiple relationships to not just audiences. I like to think of it as publics because I believe that artists have multiple kinds of relationships to people beyond just the artist audience or artist patron kind of way of thinking. And I think a useful way of thinking of the role of artists in society is that if we are all creative beings, artists help us take responsibility for our own creativity. So in the same way that in the most progressive strands of the medical profession, you have medical professionals that help people take responsibility for their health, or financial planners that help people take responsibility for their financial well-being, I think it is important to consider the role of artists in helping us take responsibility for our creative well-being. And that doesn't mean that all artists have to be engaged one-on-one with people in community centers exclusively, or in these other kinds of places that are not necessarily cultural venues, but to expand our thinking of the role of artists as those folks that help us take responsibility for our own creativity, I think is really paramount. Another question that I like to ask is, where are the places in community where people gather to be generative, to create, to imagine, to make things together, and potentially to share them and help shape the environment? And I like to think of these as cultural kitchens. And this idea of cultural kitchens came to me from a book chapter that I wrote that had to do with diversity. And the idea that diversity is a characteristic of cities that people like to tout. They like to say it's a good thing, and people want to showcase diversity. And it occurred to me that many times people are concerned, planners and others are concerned with what are the common spaces where that kind of diversity can be celebrated, but we don't think of what are the kinds of spaces in communities where one prepares what one is supposed to be sharing at this communal table. So if you think about the cultural commons as a communal table, the question that I ask is, if one is to participate in an authentic way at the communal table, where are those places where you prepare what it is that you want to share? And I think of these as cultural kitchens. And I'm inclined to believe that healthy places have cultural kitchens. They have those spaces where people gather there with the intention of being generative and sharing and creating. And what's interesting about that function is that I think it's also central to having places that have both evidence of preservation as well as innovation concurrently. And that too, I think, is a healthy sign of a community. They're not characteristics that always coexist easily, but the presence of both innovation and preservation concurrently, I think, is a really important signal. And last, I like to think about what are the qualities of a community that inspire awe. Where is awe and inspiration in a community? How do we think about, either visually or in some other sensory or even intellectual way, what are the aspects of the places that we live and inhabit that cause us to pause and make us believe that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, that we're a part of a legacy, or that there is something to which we should also contribute, that excellence is important, and that we're all committed to taking humanity to the next level. So what are those places? So I charge you, or challenge you, invite you to think about your own communities and ask the questions that I've been toying with. Is art unconfined? Is there evidence of active arts engagement? Are there artists, and how do they connect to communities, or how do they connect to us? Are there cultural kitchens? Do they exist in the places where we live? And what in our everyday life causes us to stop in awe, and what inspires? Thank you.